Thank you very much for that introduction. And before we begin, I would just like to bring our memory to one of our members of our community who we lost to this very terrible disease, Professor Michelle Casanova. I know that she has been supportive of young Iranian archaeologists from the very beginning of her career. And I first met Zahra a year ago in Lyon, working with Michelle on a dissertation defense. So Michelle, you are in our hearts and our minds. You left us too soon, and we remember that wonderful conference that we had and visit to the Mahan Garden in the winter of 2020. So I want to begin by thanking Zahra and her team for envisioning, executing such a successful program focused on the urbanization of the Iranian plateau during the Bronze Age. Through the magic of Zoom, you have done what no actual conference could have, which is to bring together 3 generations of a research community who, over the past 6 decades, have maintained a passionate interest in the history and the archaeology of Iran. Many of us had our start through field work that ended more than 4 decades ago. Others focused on unpublished legacy collections, and others have been lucky enough to continue working until now, providing us with new and fascinating evidence. The continuity of effort and interest, even in the face of challenges, is a testament to the enduring importance of ancient Iran, and in particular during the emergence of complex societies of Western Asia in the 3rd millennium BC. It is so encouraging to see this interest is infectious in a good way, and that a new generation of young Iranian and non-Iranian archaeologists is now coming up. Having first fallen in love with Iran and its magic and its archaeology at Tali Malian in the mid-1970s, I was especially lucky and extremely grateful to have been invited back in 2001 to work at the sites of Konar Sandal North and South when excavations began there in response to extensive looting in the region. Dr. Yosef Majidzadeh, director of those excavations, supported by ICAR and ICHHTO, mounted 5 seasons of excavation. I was able to participate, sometimes with students, in 3. 2003, 2005, pictured here with the team, and the last one in 2008. I am most grateful to Dr. Majidzadeh for entrusting to me the recording and the study of the works of art, which turned out to be a remarkable, rich body of glyptic art. Although there has been a hiatus of some 12 years, I am thrilled that the work has begun again at the site, now under the direction of Professor Nasir Eskandiari, who I was privileged to meet as a younger man when I was working at Konar Sandal in 2005. Over the past decade, I have published much of the glyptic evidence that we'll be looking at today in various articles, using it to situate the Halil River Valley within the larger world of the Bronze Age. The pandemic has given me enforced time away from other projects to undertake the final, I must say, daunting chore of preparing this massive material for final publication in the form of a comprehensive illustrated catalog of almost 400 seal impressions of approximately 325 individual seals, as well as a small body of actual stamps and cylinders. This will be included as one of the chapters in an upcoming volume of the Corpus of Indus Seals and Inscriptions series under the direction of Dr. Asko Parpala. I'm especially pleased to participate in this series with this material because of the exceptionally high quality of the illustrations. I show you a sample here from the volume that will include the Konar Sandal material on the chapter that's already been prepared by Ali Vatati and Raffaello Bisione on the seals from Khorasan. The recent contributions that we have heard from Massimo Vidali, Ali Vatati, and Raffaello have set the interregional stage for my more focused presentation here. Especially relevant for us is the confirmation given by Massimo of the early dating for the end of Shari Sokta, around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, as well as the detailed presentation of the remarkable administrative system, which stands in stark contrast to the one that we will discuss today. Last week, Vatati and Biscione laid out for us the territory directly impacted by the expansion of the Greater Khorasan culture, making it clear that at the end of the 3rd millennium, people moved out from the core region, seeking more stable refuge zones in response to increasingly arid conditions. While Shahdad was a destination for some of these arriving northerners, there is, at least until now, no evidence from the excavations of Konar Sandal South for the arrival of immigrants from the Greater Khorasan civilization. The moment of the flourishing of the Halil River Valley, as known through Konar Sandal South, falls between these two phenomena during the 3rd quarter of the 3rd millennium BC. The importance of the region of the Halil River has, in the 3rd millennium BC, has been known since the surveys and explorations of Sir Earl Stein. He described many of the visible archaeological sites along the Halil River, including the 2 mounds at Konar Sandal, which we see Konar Sandal North pictured here in his volume. It was not until the 60s and 70s, with the excavations of Tepe Yahya in the mountains 90 kilometers due west of the Halil River Valley, that we could begin to think about the region in relation to the wider world. From this work, combined with the earlier work of Caldwell at Tali Iblis, we understood the important Chalcolithic presence in the region, which was followed by period 4C at Yahya around 2900, marking the appearance of the Proto-Elamite material culture from the west. Susa, Malayan, Tepe Yahya, Shari Sokta all participated in the southern east-west cultural horizon, following the overland routes which Cameron Petrie so convincingly elaborated for us 2 weeks ago. The precise nature of that interaction continues to puzzle us, but it is impossible to deny that it involved both the movement of people and the transmission of cultural practices, some of which seeded developments during the subsequent period of florescence, which we see at Konar Sandal South. Both writing, which we heard about from François Dessay, and glyptic art were continued from that earlier period. As we heard from John Alden, Fars province and Malayan in particular experienced deurbanization during the middle of the 3rd millennium at the same time as the Halil River Valley flourished. The hiatus following period 4C identified at Yahya must have been very local, because in the nearby river valley, settled communities continued to flourish during the first half of the 3rd millennium. One of the research questions for the new excavations could be to define this transition more precisely. When reoccupied during the Yahya 4B period, the site continued to be very small, and to judge from the scrappy architecture and ephemeral workshop levels, perhaps it was a seasonal settlement. The most significant feature of Yahya 4B was the discovery of production areas of the locally sourced soft stone chlorite objects that came to be known as the intercultural style. Phil Cole and Lambert Karlowski proposed that craftsmen at Yahya manufactured these striking objects exclusively for export to a Mesopotamian market in exchange for what was never really very clear. The looting of the graveyards at Matutabad and Rigambar in 2000 produced hundreds of such carved objects, making it clear that this was not an export commodity, but rather one consumed locally, particularly as a grave good. Regardless, this line of interpretation established the central importance of long-distance relations between the Halil River culture and its neighbors to the west, where the distinctive objects have been found in considerable numbers, primarily in temple deposits, but also in graves. Such objects are anchored in the Mesopotamian sequence through royal inscriptions of Mesilim at the earliest to Rimush at the latest. That is in the middle chronology, about 2450 to 2250 BCE. A recent consideration by Gianni Marchese has illuminated the striking example found in the Inanna Temple at Nippur, level 7. Previously, the secondary inscription it carried was generically read as Inanna and the serpent. Marchese has offered a more precise translation for Inanna from Pab-Nune, who he suggests was a previously unattested ruler at Nippur. Further, he makes the important observation that rather than being an object of intercultural significance, the Mesopotamian ruler regarded this object as exotica, whose value resided not in its familiarity, but rather in its difference. The anchor at Yaya, as well as at Shatad to the north, served as the basis for the still very useful 1990 study by Timothy Potts, whose comprehensive survey of the archaeological and textual evidence for interaction between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau during the 3rd millennium BC. His conclusion was that robust relations flourished, especially during the 3rd quarter of the 3rd millennium, illustrated most obviously by the contents of the royal cemetery. These commercial relations became militarized during the early part of the Old Akkadian period, whose rulers sought to control access to trade routes, replacing commercial exchange with coercion and extraction of booty. Potts concluded that the overland route was always active, supplemented by seafaring vessels whose primary destinations was Oman for copper and diorite. Such a reconstruction makes the depopulation of Fars difficult to understand. The exploration of Konar Sandal has and will continue in the future to go a long way toward providing precision to our understanding of interactions between the Hollow River Valley and its neighbors. While we still await the publication of the architecture and ceramic evidence, the rich body of glyptic art provides articulate material for what seems to have been something considerably more complex than the command export of a single commodity. Further, the results from Konar Sandal South allow us to see that the relations, focused solely toward the west from the perspective of the chlorite, were in fact with neighbors both far and nearby in all directions. The site served as a nexus to which actors from across the entire region traveled to engage in exchange for what I surmise was locally available raw and semi-processed materials. The glyptic evidence indicates that these exchanges were mediated through a distinctive administrative system controlled through seals and their impressions. If correct, this administrative system was entirely different from the one used to monitor the receipt and distribution of staple goods, which Massimo laid out for us the other day. It is also completely different from the one seen at Tepe Yaya during the Proto-Elamite period, which exploited both writing and seals for internal record keeping. In fact, the system of administration that we see at Konar Sandal South is unique among the many 4th and 3rd millennium systems that I have studied. Rather than facing inward, as those systems do, this system looked outward, serving to control for discrete acts of commerce exchange between agents coming from many places, agents who both they and we can identify through the highly differentiated styles and iconographies of their seals. So with that as an introduction, let's see how this might have worked. Unlike the rest of the Iranian plateau, the Hollow River Valley is lush, well-watered, and has incredibly rich soil continually renewed through an annual inundation of the plain. A survey undertaken in the 1990s revealed more than 80 3rd millennium sites ranging from small, medium to large. The looted graves, only about half a kilometer distant from Konar Sandal South, were buried under more than 5 meters of alluvium, telling us that the 3rd millennium population of the river valley must have been very dense and that what is visible on the surface is just the tip of the iceberg. The first time I visited there, I was astounded by how different the valley was from any other place I'd been in Iran. It reminded me of southern Iraq, ancient Sumer, only surrounded on three sides by high mountains covered in snow all year round and full of natural resources waiting to be exploited. In the summers, the temperatures consistently reach into the 40s centigrade, and anyone who can escapes to higher ground to their summer homes, something like Tepiyaya. The river itself, like most of those on the plateau, does not reach the open water, but debouches instead into the oasis, the Jaz Murian, where it mixes waters with westward flowing Bampur River. Now there is a paved road from Jirof to Bandar Abbas, Iran's main port on the Persian Gulf. By foot, it's an easy 5-day walk. Konar Sandal South is a large, low mound with a small citadel emerging at its center. When surveyed by Gabriel Pizzorno in 2005, the site was determined to extend over about 80 hectares. I think the new survey and excavations will probably show that the site is larger, with agriculture encroaching on all sides. Some kilometers to the north is Konar Sandal North, a large stepped platform built over a lower archaeological mound. Although Majidzade's work did not establish the precise chronological relation between the two mounds, it is likely that the Konar Sandal South constricted to the citadel sometime around the end of the third quarter of the third millennium, perhaps in response to the shifting course of the meandering Halil River, causing the local population to move a short distance to the north. To judge from the pottery from the mound under the platform, it seems generally contemporary with Tepiyaya 4A, perhaps the end of the third into the second millennium BC. Majidzadeh opened 10 operations at Konar Sandal South. Across the road, you can see trenches 9 and 8. One of these was a craft production quarter with a special emphasis on copper metallurgy. The other produced very clear evidence for earlier Aliabad type pottery. Closer to the citadel itself, 4 trenches on the lower mound are relevant for the Glyptic art. Simin Paran, who I think is in the audience, revealed a very handsome house in which 4 compartmented stamp seals of copper bronze were found. In trench 14, excavated in 2006 and again briefly in 2008, scrappy architecture was uncovered that was full of trash, full of pigments that had been clearly redeposited from someplace else. In the trash were 4 seal impressions, all belonging to the early third millennium, contemporary with the Proto-Elamite occupation at 4C Yaya. We'll look at these in a minute. About 50 meters to the east is trench 11, which was excavated by Elif Unlu, whose name I have seen on some of these lectures. I don't see her here today, but she did a great job. And she revealed there 3 strata of architectural occupation, and you see a photograph of that here. In the lowest level, exposed in a small sounding, she found a rich charcoal deposit within this architectural context that provided a date of 2887 to 2551 at 95% accuracy, which is perfectly in line with the cross-dating established through the Glyptic art from trench 14, which we'll get to in a minute. 2 other operations provided the bulk of the administrative evidence that we'll look at today. Trench 3, which you see here going underneath the citadel mound. It revealed an administrative area that is referred to in the 2008 preliminary report as the early citadel phase. 95 ceilings were found on its floor, together with a number of complete large storage vessels. Let me see if I've got complete large storage vessels with raised snake band decoration on the shoulder. Also on the floor was a large chlorite plaque of the type manufactured at Tepiyaya and found in large numbers in the graves. Two burnt branches identified as Konar species by Margareta Tenberg gave us two radiocarbon dates as 2480 to 2210 and 2480 to 2290. In relative terms, this puts Trench 3, early Citadel period, squarely in the range of the early dynastic to early Old Akkadian period. Trench 5 is of a different character than the primary deposit in Trench 3. I'm going to go back here just to show you that Trench 5 is right here, close to the road. So Trench 5 is a large open air platform that you can see exposed here with a large pit of trash along the edge. On the platform itself was extensive evidence for the processing of colorful stones and other craft detritus. And in the pit at the edge of the platform were found hundreds of impressions of seals on clay closing devices, mixed together with trash, primarily ceramics, as well as some animal bone and charcoal. The depth of the trash was approximately 1.5 meters, and it extended along the face of the platform about 4 meters. No carbon was collected for dating, but the essential contemporaneity of trenches 3 and 5 is reinforced by the overlapping seal impressions, by the close comparisons in the larger Glyptic bodies, and by the fact that the pottery in each is similar and very coherent. This is important to stress because some who have written about this material see differences within the corpus as a reflection of time. This is a mistake. It is, in fact, all contemporary and was probably accumulated over a relatively short period of time. This is centrally important for understanding what this evidence can tell us about the place of Konar Sandal South in its world. So what can we make from the seal impressions of Konar Sandal South to place the site within the larger universe around from 2900 down to about 2300 BC? Here's another picture of the platform. We know from reports by Vidale de Say and Majidzadeh, there is evidence for late 4th, early 3rd millennium occupation nearby Konar Sandal South. They uncovered it through salvage work that they did in the looted graveyard of Matutabad in close proximity to Konar Sandal. They reported Aliabad ware, as you can see here, and bevel rim bowls, and very fragmentary Glyptic, which clearly anchors occupation in the valley to a phase contemporary with period 4C at Yaya. Also among the looted materials confiscated by the Revolutionary Guard and deposited in the Kerman Ikar Museum are Proto-Elamite seals, the impression of one you see here on the screen, that came from the looted graves. As I mentioned earlier, from the tertiary burnt trash of Trench 14, 4 seal impressions were found that can also be associated with this phase. All of these impressions are interesting, and the fact that they were found together allows us to imagine a diverse community of seal users were present at Konar Sandal at the same time as the Proto-Elamite tablets and seals were being used for internal documentation at Yaya. Although only more context will allow us to understand the administrative community in this early period, to judge from the seals, these users were not engaged in local administration, but even at this early date, these impressions are residue from transactions between locals and outsiders. The most remarkable sealing is that of a city seal, with legible signs that denote certainly the city of Ur, perhaps Nippur, and other identifiable places, through sign formations identical to those found on the city seals from the seal impression strata at Ur. And I just illustrate one of the most common pointer here. Anyway, in the bottom of the screen, you can see a drawing reconstruction of one of the clearest of those seal impression strata impressions. As important is the fact that this southern Mesopotamian seal, was not carried on a portable object, but rather, as you can see from the back of the sealing, it was impressed on a door closing device, requiring us to understand that the seal user, either as a Mesopotamian who probably traveled by boat or in my mind, less likely that the user of this seal had somehow acquired it in Mesopotamia. It was certainly manufactured most probably at Ur. Among the sealings from Konar Sandal South, there are in fact very few door sealings. Most of them are packages, smaller, larger, textiles, leather, and some jars, suggesting that long-term bulk storage was not the primary function of the administrative period. The other three sealings, all impressed with stamps, also give hints of who participated in this early seal using community. The most striking is this large stamp seal with a frontal image of a standing bull. Well, there is nothing closely similar that I know. The image brings to mind animals acting as humans iconography of the Proto-Elamite Glyptic, locally familiar at the time through Tepe Yaya. We will also see continuation of Proto-Elamite themes in the later seal impressions from Trench 5. Another impression with a scalloped edge finds close comparisons to the east at Shari Sokta period 2, and the last impression on the bottom is not made by a proper seal, but rather with the side of an amulet in the shape of a recumbent sheep. While local examples were recovered from the confiscated material, and I illustrate one of them here, it is an artifact type that has its origins and closest parallels in the Mesopotamian West, where many examples are known from Uruk as well as Ur and other sites. If we look at a most informative map that Benjamin Moutin prepared in his republication of Tepe Yaya 4C, what he sees in the pottery at Tepe Yaya, right in the middle where all those colors overlap, there it is right there, is also reflected or may be reflected in this small set of contemporary Glyptic. Already at this early period, people are coming to the Hollow River Valley from long distances. At Yaya, the different pottery types reflect overland interaction, while the seals from Trench 14 suggest that a parallel and later more successful sea route was also in use. At the site itself, so far, we have only continuous occupation from the early to middle third millennium through the small sounding in Trench 11. We know that the Glyptic from Trench 14, that there are earlier periods at the site, and determining what their relationship is to Tepe Yaya will be particularly interesting and is another high priority when looking for research goals for future excavation. The third quarter of the third millennium was the heyday of Konar Sandal South. Pierre Amier called this the Age of Exchange, which is, at its widest extent, engaged the entire known world of the Near East, from Western Anatolia to the Indus Valley. The roots of this period are clearly marked on this map from Michael Rouf's endlessly useful Atlas of Mesopotamia. The Glyptic from Konar Sandal South, nicely indicated in this green dot here, helps to make this exchange system more visible. The diversity hinted at the Trench 14 assemblage is overwhelming in the large sample from Trench 3 and 5. This is just a handful of the more than 350 impressions found so far. This diversity is manifest not only in subject matter, which is typical for seal assemblages, but importantly, it is especially clear through the radical differences in the style of execution. Precisely relevant to this topic of diversity are the seals from Yaya 4B and Shahdat, which are contemporary with the Konar Sandal assemblage. Each site produced a handful of seals, all sharing the same subject matter of female goddesses, winged or with vegetation. Within each site, and indeed between them, there is in fact very little diversity in iconography. What is striking about these seals, however, is the distinct styles in which their imagery is cut. At Yaya, All of the cylinders are cut from the local chlorite or steatite with a gouging or cutting tool. While at Shahdad, the same imagery of goddesses is carried on seals, this time cut from a smooth white stone, probably magnesite, using a drilling tool to produce rounded modeled forms. That is the exception. At the bottom here is an exception to this characterization, and I will discuss that one later. Among the seals, contemporary impressions from Konar Sandal South are impressions of virtually identical seals showing deities in both styles. The difference at Konar Sandal is that these examples were found together with hundreds of other impressions having different subject matter and cut in different styles. These two contemporary comparisons help us to understand how seals were used in the Halil River Valley during this time. We can imagine that the users of the seals from Yaya or Shahdad, for example, would have carried their seals down to the valley on market day and used them to control for exchanges of preciosities or food or other commodities on offer. At the end of the transaction, the out-of-towners went home. They took their seals with them, either to be lost in the exigencies of daily life, such as at Yaya, or to be buried as a marker of identity when they passed to the other side. But the residue of the administrative processes remained at Konar Sandal South, eventually ending up in the trash. The shared iconography rendered in these two distinct styles were probably familiar to all who needed to know. From this, we can infer that the impressions of other such seals were traces of users who came from nearby but outside of Konar Sandal itself, or who came from further differences. A further important research strategy that would help to test this hypothesis would be to undertake neutron activation analysis on the clay of different style groups of sealings to determine whether the seal users moved or if sealed packages indeed were moving. Turning now to the seals from trenches 3 and 5, I will focus on the stylistic groups of seals seeking to associate them with distinct regions. As we did with trench 14, if we start with connections to the west, there are a number of seal impressions from both trenches that find their closest parallels to southern Mesopotamia or to Susa. From trench 3, there were found several impressions from an actual Mesopotamian seal or a close copy. Two are virtually identical copies to familiar Mesopotamian themes of animals emerging from the byre. And you can see down here two examples, one early dynastic one from Ur, a later one more contemporary with this Konar Sandal impression that dated stylistically to early dynastic 3. The close connection to Mesopotamia is reinforced particularly through this standard emerging from the top of this byre that has the distinctive marker of divinity. Another fragmentary example, another scene depicts a manufacturing scene in which a figure, maybe female, sits in front of a vessel with a skein of thread emerging from the mouth. The best comparisons from this are earlier, certainly, than what we have at Konar Sandal here. I'm showing illustrations here from the Uruk period Glyptic from Susa. Another fragmentary example depicts a rampant animal that is crossed from behind by another inverted animal. This is if the interpretation is correct, this is a local version of the ubiquitous animal combat scene that we have in early dynastic Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian connections are even clearer in Trench 5, where at least a dozen highly legible fragments of impressions were made by cylinders that were certainly imported from Sumer. Among them, so I'm showing you here a fragment of an animal combat scene. Here's the illustration, and this is not easy to read, but once you can see it, here's the frontal head of the lion here, and he is grasping at the body of this inverted horned caprid. Here I'm just giving you some comparanda from Mesopotamia, the Akalam Dug seal to Meskalam Dug seal from the Royal Cemetery. This is the time horizon that we're located in. So early dynastic 3B. Other examples of this group, here we see the head of a deer being bitten by on the neck by a lion, the crossed animals, and another of these combat scenes. Again, just showing you the close, very close comparison with seals from Mesopotamia. Another of these connections to the west is this spread-winged bird of prey, flanked by a lion and bull combat. This is a scene that certainly originates in Mesopotamia, but is very popular both in the painting of ceramics and glyptic on the Iranian plateau as well. So this is an example. It was likely manufactured locally, but is drawing on those Western parallels. The imagery of another type of seal is also very well attested at Konar Sandal and is known in the West, but not in Mesopotamia, rather only in Susa. This style is rendered in a gouged style. These seals, many of them are very large. The forms are deeply cut with a very sharp cutting tool. Seals of this style are found in large numbers in both trenches 3 and 5. Many, like this example, have fabulous iconography, like this snake-headed rampant feline who is attacking a caprid. And to the side is this seated couple, surrounded by a snaky twist, which is a completely local theme that we see repeated both in seals and on lapis discs and on the famous Shahdad standard. Many of these seals have toothed borders, top and bottom. In the sample from Konar Sandal South, this is one of the largest groups that we have, with about 50 recognizable seals being reconstructed. Amier published about 30 examples from Susa, and he considers them to be local productions rendered in what he considered a degenerate style. The only actual seal of this type that is known to me is one from Ur, which is illustrated on the bottom, which is a total outlier within Mesopotamia and is usually identified as coming from the Indus Valley. Well, it's certainly an import into Mesopotamia, together with the carved chlorite. I think it more likely that it came to the Halil River region. I think that it's likely that it came from the Halil River region, where the humped bull, the scorpion, the palm tree, and the hatch border is all very common. This seal could have easily come in the pocket of a trader who arrived at Ur on a boat that had stopped at a port in Bandar Abbas to pick up colorful stones, exotic woods, gold and silver, which funneled off of the plateau through the valley. It is difficult to know whether we should understand the style of the seal as associated with individuals from Susa, given that it is robustly represented at Susa, or whether it comes from somewhere else on the Iranian plateau. Once we find some actual seals of this type in situ, we can begin to narrow down the possibilities. My hunch is that it will find its home on the plateau, someplace perhaps in close proximity to the Halil River Valley. Finally, among this type of seals are two examples of elongated quadrupeds seen here, coming from Konar Sandal South. And at Susa, we have one example that is virtually identical. So now we've looked at the West. Now we'll turn to relations that can be clearly established to the South and to the East. The evidence for this is very different, but also as compelling. The contact was manifest not through impressions, but rather through seals themselves, together with other tools of commerce. This copper seal, which I illustrate on the top of the slide, was found on the surface of Konar Sandal South. There's no question that it was imported from the Indus Valley, where it finds its closest parallels, both in form and in iconography, to it at Lothal, in the far eastern part of the Indus Valley civilization. Another striking parallel from this part of the world is a terracotta seal of a type that is known in the periphery of the Indus Valley culture in the Ahar Banas culture zone. Marta Ameri, who I think is in the audience, has published this group in the Knoyer Festschrift. Both impressions from Gilland, which I show up above, and seals from the Ahar Basin on view in the museum, require us to understand that the unique example from Konar Sandal South was certainly imported from the East. I was also struck in looking at the publication of Ahtati and Biscione of the close comparison of this seal, it should be copper, not sopper, from one of their sites in the greater Khorasan civilization. So this is a type that has its home to the east of the Indus Valley, but is a type that is copied throughout this greater region. On the platform associated with the pit of Trench 5, Akram Golami retrieved this selection of small finds, including drills, raw lapis, small shells, alabaster discs, and weights from the Indus Valley. More than a dozen such weights were found in various trenches, primarily spheres with some of them with the flat bottoms, which is typical of the ones from the Indus Valley. And in addition, we have this one cubical weight, which is also clearly an Indus Valley type. These are clearly tools of commerce and exchange. While both the stamp seals and the weights are clearly imports to Konar Sandal South, the reverse direction of exchange is likely illustrated by this example on the top. A very striking stamp seal found in Trench 5 pit that is identical in shape to one that was found in Mohenjo-Daro, illustrated below, where it is certainly unique. If we expand our sample to Yahya and Shahdad, we can suggest that this is a local type of stamp seal that finds close comparisons through two examples found in the graves at Shahdad. The iconography is mirrored on this copper bronze lid, and they are all carved in this very fine white stone. I also include here this round seal from Tepe Yahya, which, although round instead of square, certainly belongs in this group. Turning now to links across the Gulf, these are more tenuous and they can be suggested only through the borrowing of individual motifs found on the seals of Konar Sandal South that were integrated into the repertoire of the designs used in the later Dilmun style seals. And I'm pointing here obviously to this frontal bull head with the single eye, which is so typical of the Dilmun seals. We see it here in this stamp seal and again in this cylinder seals. There's a considerable amount of time between these, and so whether there is any actual connection between Konar Sandal South and Dilmun is tentative. But Dan Potts has argued that it's at this moment, basically, that ceramic technology is imported across the Straits of Hormuz from what would be the Hollow River Valley and beginning the ceramic tradition of that period. So we know that there is certainly interaction across the Gulf. So having illuminated the long distance interaction visible at Konar Sandal South, let's shift now to the Iranian highlands to see what the Glyptic can tell us about their participation in these commercial transactions that are preserved in the Glyptic. If we stick to stamp seals at the beginning, For a moment, we can see that at Konar Sandal South, there's a rich variety of stamp seal impressions of various compartmented types. Some of them find parallels at Sharisokta period 2, where seals both of stone, which are illustrated here, and copper were found in large numbers. Others find closer parallels closer to the Hollow River Valley. For example, at the site of Damin comes this seal, which is virtually identical to the one that we see preserved in the seal impression here. But there are others, especially this one and this one, that are very striking. And to my knowledge, do not yet have parallels really anywhere else on the plateau. We now turn to the seal imagery found in both trenches 3 and 5. And there are, really in gross terms, 3 main types that we're having documented there. One group of these shows deities, which are very similar to what we saw at Yaya and Shatan. Others show what I kind of generally identify as narrative scenes. And then there's a final style that I've dubbed as the linear style, which is really only represented at Konar Sandal, with the one exception from Shatan. So if we look at the deities, the most obvious connections are with Yaya and Shatan, as I think you can see through these seals. Primarily found in Trench 5, these were impressions of divine images that were carved both in the gouge style and in the more modeled styles of the graves of Shatan. What distinguishes this component of the assemblage from those sites is the fact that the iconography is not solely limited to female deities, but rather includes both males and females with a number of different divine attributes. And so there's a much greater variety within the iconography that we see all mixed together in these impressions. I'll show you a few more examples just so that you can see the range. Whether the iconographic differences reflect place is hard to know. But there were certainly hundreds of contemporary villages and towns in the land surrounding Konar Sandal South, and it's not impossible that each one could have been associated with a different deity. It is this type of seal that is exported from the Halil River, or perhaps from Kerman, to the greater Khorasan civilization to the north. 4 such seals were found at Gonor. Another was found on the surface of a nearby mound. None of these are locally produced. None of them are of the typical stamp cylinder type that are certainly made in the region. And indeed, as I've argued in print, it's, I think, pretty obvious that much of the imagery that is so distinctive for the greater Khorasan civilization was adapted, borrowed, and modified for their own purposes through this imagery that comes through the medium of the seals. Beyond deities, subject matter of the Konar cylinders ranges from narrative scenes like these ones in Trench 3, which show different kinds of ceremonial scenes, to fragments of humans engaged in different activities. Although fragmentary, it's possible to see that many of these are carved in a highly modeled and very expert, by expert lapidaries. Several of the impressions carry imagery that I associate with the legacy of the Proto-Elamite style. Here we're seeing a dancing lion, perhaps, with a crouching animals acting as humans. Here we see a whorl of animal heads, very similar to one known from Proto-Elamite period at Tepe Yaya. This one has the stylistic features of deep flat cutting and gouged internal differentiation, very large proportions, which is something that was typical of proto-Elamite glyptic. And this extraordinary seal must have been more than 10 centimeters in height. What you see preserved here is the head of a lion with his huge claw reaching out. It is deeply, deeply carved with many levels of articulation in the image. Okay, so now we'll turn to the linear style, and this is the last style that we'll look at. I believe that this linear style is local to the Hollow River Valley, and it was perhaps even the official style of the Hollow River Valley. Where these seals fit precisely within the universe of the glyptic that I consider to be commercial, I'm not entirely sure. I have named this style the linear style because, as I think you'll appreciate, it is this making of form through line, which really best characterizes this group. Before the work at Konar Sandal, the only example of this type that I was aware of is this one that I'm illustrating here. It's a silver seal, highly corroded, from one of the graves. It had received no attention because it was so odd, but in fact it is a classic example of the type and must have come across the mountains from the Hollow River up to Shashdad. Linear style seals are squat and fat, with a diameter and a height being essentially equal, giving a long, narrow band for the imagery. While not all are carved of metal, that must have been the dominant material because of the linear nature of the style. That is certainly an adaptation to that medium. At Konar Sandal, this linear style was found in both trenches 3 and 5. Indeed, the strongest evidence for the contemporaneity of the two deposits is the occurrence in each of these trenches of multiple impressions of a single seal, which was a stamp seal, circular, that carried a square design of a snake interlaced that brought these heads of snakes and humans together in the center. So these are the ones that come from trench 3, and in trench 5 there were 10, 11 examples. In addition, in trench 5 we have the evidence that this very distinctive seal was used to counter seal another seal of the linear style. There are 2 other examples of the use of counter sealing. This is a practice that we know, especially in the ED1 period in Mesopotamia. How exactly it's working here at Konar Sandal, I'm not entirely sure, but it clearly was an important part of the sealing process. The seal that this stamp seal countered or was impressed on top of can be reconstructed through about 30 fragments impressions. The long scene depicts a seated human figure offering a bow and arrow, to a seated figure who can be identified as divine by this horned bull head that emerges from the center of his forehead. Behind this pair, and separated by a complex heraldic separator, are 3 striding males who are wearing kilts, who can also be recognized as divine through their wings and through their distinctive headgear. Here, this one wears a bird head. This one has the horns coming from the top, and this one's head does not survive. I'll forego any interpretation because my time is really running short. But this must be the depiction of the investiture of a local paramount ruler here, perhaps in the company of some ancestor kings. Other linear style seals, I'm just going to give you a few examples so you can see how wonderful and distinctive this style is. This one is impressed on a tag from Trench 3 and can be reconstructed as a female figure seated opposite this man with long snaky hair and another man in the back. Another example from Trench 3 is also on a tag, and we see a version of that same seated figure confronting another figure, the same heraldic composition and the same standing figures behind. So this is another version of that seal that I consider to be the official or royal seal. And then just fragments of other linear style seals that we can imagine what the imagery might have been. There are a number of these seals that actually exist as seals themselves. We've looked at the one from Shashdad. And so I want to just show you several that were confiscated from the looters and are now in the Kerman Museum. This one, this is a drawing of the impression here, trying to understand it. They usually have a seated here or a standing figure together with an animal combat scene. Here we've got floating heads. Both of these are in copper and are, as I said, in the Kerman Museum. This is one that is in a collection of an Iranian who lives in the region. And I want to end this extended presentation by looking at this one for a moment. While most of the linear style seals carry local iconography, which you have seen examples of, especially these confronted figures or goddesses on the backs of animals. This one illustrates another twist in the story of interaction that I am trying to tell here. It's on a copper seal, and we see a heroic figure here in a chariot being drawn by 4 quadrupeds. Behind him is a combat scene of a hero in a kilt and a lion, and then behind them is a second figure with what seems to be a fish. This scene is unique at Konar Sandal South or in the Hollow River Valley, and it must have been inspired by a Mesopotamian source where chariot scenes are common, and they are frequently associated with a combat scene. So this is the seal of Al-Kalam Dug in the Royal Cemetery. And so down below we have the ruler in the chariot, and we know that the reference is warfare, and we have defeated prisoners here. And then up above is this classic early dynastic combat scene. But unlike the scene in Mesopotamia, which is always associated with warfare, the implication of the appropriated version doesn't seem to me, at least, to suggest warfare, which was so typical in the Western city-states. Rather, to me, it maybe is representing the triumph or the status of the paramount ruler in reference to his having been invested with this power by the local gods. Warfare is in fact conspicuously absent in the imagery as well as in the artifact assemblage on the Iranian plateau during this third part of the 3rd millennium. Okay, so there is much more that I could talk about, but I know you're all really tired of staring at these difficult to read impressions on your screens. So let me just say that I'm very optimistic that with the beginning of new excavations at this most important site, many of the questions that were first raised by the campaigns of Majid can be addressed. And eventually, the proper place of the Halil River Valley in the larger story of urbanization on the Iranian plateau will be established, not through the names recorded in the Mesopotamian text, but through the clear voice of the material culture itself. And with that, I offer Nasir and his team the best of luck. And I thank you for your attention. And I send my warmest thanks and good wishes to my Iranian colleagues, especially to Yosef Majidadeh, to Akram Golami, and to Simin Piran. This was a picture taken after we had just made a very exciting discovery. I miss you all very, very much, and will remember the days at Konar Sandal as the happiest ones of my career. So good luck with this magical site. Thank you.